Welcome to the ECE Classroom podcast with your host, SusieBeghin, inspiring early childhood educators every day. Hello, and welcome to the ECE Classroom, a podcast where we dive deep into the world of early childhood education and creative learning strategies. I'm your host, SusieBeghin, and today I'm so excited to welcome a guest named Andy Baker. He is a behavior specialist and author. Welcome, Andy.
Hi there, how you doing?
I'm so excited to have you here today. I'm sure that you're going to bring a wealth of knowledge into the field of early childhood education, and our listeners are mostly early childhood educators. So I'm sure they're going to learn a lot from you in terms of behavior management, behavior strategies. But before we dive into the topic, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Andy Baker. Obviously, from the accent, you may be able to guess where I potentially come from. It may be a throw up between Australia and Britain, but I'm from England. So I come from a health and social care background, predominantly. It's been 20 or so years, probably a bit over, that I was working in that sector. And I started specialising in complex behaviours about 18, 19 years ago. So my background is psychology, psychotherapy, and various forms of behaviour management. And I've kind of worked in a multitude of different settings, ranging from, I've been a foster parent in children's services, and then all the way up to elderly dementia care as well. So I've kind of explored all the different realms of human behaviour. And then I started a training company about 10 years ago. So that's my kind of main job, main business is training and educating in schools and as well as various other settings around better understanding behaviour and managing behaviour that challenges. So hopefully that's, I think, what some of your listeners will be interested in.
Absolutely. I know that I put a question out to my educators a couple months ago, and I said, what would you like to see on the podcast? And the number one question, the number one concern that always comes up is, how do we manage challenging behaviors in the classroom? So let's just start with that. I mean, just generally, what kind of strategies, what kind of things should educators do when they encounter challenging behaviors?
Yeah. So it's one of the things I think it is the most commonly asked question, and I think classroom management and managing behaviour that challenges is frustrating, challenging, and feels like it really impacts on people on a day-to-day basis. So it is such a big topic. As far as what I wish I could give all of your listeners is kind of the magic word. You just say this and every child will melt into calmness and regulation and positive behaviour. But if I had that word, I'd obviously have a Nobel Prize. So there isn't a word that's going to work. There's a few kind of principles that I try and get over that I think are most important. One of the ones is even thinking about how we change language. She mentioned it there as challenging behaviour. My preferred term is behaviour that challenges. And although it's only one word difference, it is quite significant in the fact that, there's some behaviours that I might find very, very difficult. Let's take an example. We've got a child who swears, okay? Mm-hmm. I might be, swear word doesn't bother me. I have to manage it, but I don't class as challenging behaviour, okay? Whereas you might be, I find that language really upsetting and difficult. Hearing a child talk like that, I find it really difficult to cope with. That doesn't mean that you're right and I'm wrong or vice versa. It's just that's what we find challenging as different people. But if I was working with a child with a diagnosis of the rare form of Tourette's that involved swearing, I wouldn't be able to label it as their challenging behaviour. I might still find it challenging, but I'm never going to change it. So I need to change the way I feel about it rather than to change your behaviour itself. Does that make sense as a starting point? So I always say, if I spend the rest of the podcast clicking my pen, quite a few of your listeners are probably going, if that guest doesn't stop doing that, I'm not listening to this podcast anymore, and you find it challenging. Now, I may be using pen clicking as a strategy to manage my own self-regulation, to feel comfortable, to cope. It doesn't make it any less annoying and irritating for you. So that's where we're changing that kind of concept, that it's us that's finding it challenging, not just them. But it is helping us to understand that if we are finding a behaviour challenging for a child, more than likely they're not having a great time either. So,
Right.
especially if they're dysregulated.
Yeah.
So, one of the main principles, and hopefully one of the takeaways that your listeners will go, is I encourage everyone to be a better detective than judge. That needs to
Yeah.
be kind of rule number one. Why this? Why now? What's wrong for this child? What are they feeling right now? Or what might have happened in the past that could be presenting in the present? By forcing us to ask those questions, and I'm sure many of your listeners, watchers have heard before, all behavior is a form of communication. The problem is sometimes we have a prejudgment of what we think they're trying to say. And we then go into slightly judgmental, like they're just being difficult, they're just being defiant, they're just being this, that, and the other, rather than going, but why? What's a benefit to them from being defiant in this moment? There must be a benefit, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
So it's that exploratory, it's curiosity, I would say, is one of the biggest key tools I encourage people to utilize.
Yeah, that's wonderful, actually. I've done a bunch of workshops about self-regulation, and that's one of the first things we encounter is, there's a reason for the behavior. There's a reason why things are happening. We just don't know yet. We have to find out what the reason is. And I love that approach of being curious to figure things out before we pass judgment on the behavior, calling it challenging or whatever the term we use. And I was thinking, when I just before we got on the podcast, I was thinking, I wonder if I should use the term challenging behavior or just trying to turn it, because it sounds kind of negative. I was wondering if we should just turn it around into positive, saying, how can we encourage positive behavior or positive behavior traits, things like that. So
Yes.
yeah, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and that would be a wonderful way for us to start thinking generally. So obviously in my book, it's called Targeting the Positive, and it is trying to kind of focus on that, because sometimes, if you've got when we're thinking about language, I think language is very important, as I said at the beginning there. Let's say you've got a child who displays attention seeking behavior. Let's refer to it in its slightly derogatory term.
Hmm.
um, I don't like that term. We've moved over in a lot of the settings I work in. We've moved over to attachment needing or connection seeking behavior instead, rather than attention seeking. Not because they're not wanting attention, but it's so linked to old logic parenting that if a child is doing something we don't want them to do to get attention, the way to manage that is to ignore them. If we ignore them, that teaches them that's not what to do. I worked with a girl when she was being ignored. She started slamming her head on the table as hard as she possibly could, because it worked. Because sometimes bad attention is better than no attention at all.
Hmm.
So the instinct from a lot of people, well, we couldn't just ignore her for one, because she was causing herself injury and damage. So suddenly that, planned ignoring doesn't work. But also, if we just went, we'll just ignore her, but she doesn't know how else to get that attention. So if we only take away the one tool she knows, and she doesn't have any other tool available, then she's going to carry on doing the only thing she knows. So the whole objective, and you just very rightly mentioned there, is what do we want her to do to gain attention? Because if we understand that attention's a normal part of human needs, Maslow's hierarchy, it's, up on number 3 as far as human requirements are concerned. Under all the study we now have done on attachment, that attachment and human connection is as vital for survival and well-being as food and water is. If a child was wandering around following in a classroom going, I haven't eaten all morning, please can I get a biscuit? You wouldn't just go, just ignore them, they're just starving. So why would we ever do that around something else that they need, which is attention? We just need to teach them the right way of gaining it. But if we
Right.
don't know the right way for them, that we want them to gain it, they're going to carry on doing the wrong way. And I often find that a lot of adults, we know what we don't want them doing, but we don't really explicitly know what we do want them doing. And you'll hear adults throwing out phrases like, well, I just want them to be good. Well, what does good mean in an explicit way? Because in your frame of reference, it will mean good, this means this. But does they come from the same background, the same culture, the same understanding, the same communication skills? I mean, that good is potentially meaningless. It's like, I want them to be respectful. What if they come from a household where respect is shown by dominance and fear? Well,
Right.
suddenly you go, and you should respect me. Well, that means fear you then, which most teachers, I'm sure, don't want the kids fearing them.
No,
So, yeah.
absolutely not. No. And, in terms of intention-seeking behavior that you mentioned, when we in the classroom environment, there's a certain number of children per educator. So let's
Mm-hmm.
say, in a daycare environment, in let's say a preschool classroom, there's about 8 kids per educator. So 8 children are vying for the attention of that one educator. And when you into a classroom of 16 with 2 educators, really, it's 16 children vying for the attention of one of those educators. So, yes, we do see a lot of that type of behavior. And it's good that you pointed that out, that ignoring is not the solution, right? And that's not the way to um, encourage positive behavior, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So the planned ignoring thing comes from very old logic. And some kids, yeah, you ignore or you don't react. I always say you ignore the behavior, you don't ever ignore the person. Is probably the best way of looking at it. So you don't ignore the
That's,
child,
yeah,
you may ignore the behavior.
that's,
So you
that's a
may,
nice way of looking at it.
yeah. So, and you should always respond rather than react as well. So the first thing we should be doing, if a child is displaying some behavior that we're finding connection seeking, then we need to go, well, why? What are they feeling right now that's causing them to need to feel that connection? Are they feeling lonely? Are they feeling isolated? Are they struggling with this work? Are they, um, do they not know how else to communicate that they need something? And so by pausing and responding rather than reacting and taking that moment to go, I say, what's the unmet need or what stress are they experiencing right now that they feel that this is the appropriate behavior to either meet that need or cope with that stress? And then
Right.
from our aim is going to be, well, can I meet that need? Can I eliminate the stress? Or what skills do I need to teach them to do it themselves in a socially appropriate way? That
Yeah.
would be the kind of that
So I'm going to segue into the second question about your
of
sixth
course.
stage. But where do you talk about this? Is that in your book?
Yeah, yeah. So I say I've been teaching this for probably 15 or so years, and one of the things that I found I teach in all of these different settings, both in from mental health, learning disability, adults living with dementia, all the way down to then foster care, children's services, schools. And I kind of noticed there's a commonality. There's a kind of a structure that kind of works across the board, even though there's nuances and it's more understanding the person though, understanding the conditions and understanding the person. So, I teach courses on dementia and things like that because I've worked with them. I teach courses on autism attachment and trauma because I've worked with individuals with those challenges. That doesn't mean if I've done I can teach about autism, I understand the concept of autism. It doesn't mean I understand a kid, but it does help me to then that combined with their personality, biography, and things like that help me to better understand why things might be occurring. But then people are people as far as the way we react to stimulus and stuff like that. So the six-stage target model kind of came out of a process really that I just thought, let's try and create a simple process for helping people to figure out what to do, how to manage behavior. Yeah.
Hmm. Can you walk us through that a little bit? I mean, at
Yeah.
a high level here, I guess, because
Yeah.
I'm sure you can't go into it in depth, but just give us a taste of it so our listeners, if they're interested, can explore it a little further.
Yeah, of course. So the six-stage target model fits into what I call the proactive management level. So we have 3 levels as far as our behavior management hierarchy. So we look at the preventative, which is about environmental and cultural factors that we do to reduce the chances of behavior occurring. Then we've got at the other end, we've got our troubleshooting when the behavior's already occurred, which I always think's like firefighting. Like
Right.
we had to deal with the fire is. But if we're firefighting, we try and put things in place to stop a fire from occurring. We don't just fill the place with fire extinguishers. So it's really important that we have the stuff on the bottom is the most important, the preventative. And proactive management falls in the middle. And it's where we become a little bit more child-centered. So the 6 stages are we identify the behavior, we understand and empathize with the behavior, we then create a proactive plan, we then recognize escalation, so where they are in their emotional journey, we respond appropriately, and then we learn from the incident. Okay, that's the kind of strategy in the plan. When we're identifying, we try and identify 2 different behaviors. Adaptive, as you mentioned, the behavior we actually want, that they already are doing, that we want to encourage, and then the maladaptive that we need to understand. And then we start going through that cycle on the maladaptive behaviors.
Right. I believe that we really need to become detectives, like you said, as early childhood educators. We so often encounter so many types of individuals, unique personalities, temperaments. Um, it really is important that we get to know them deeply and really understand what's going on with them. And sometimes it means we need to know things like what's going on at home, what's going on when they're not here, because that could be impacting them. Tell me a little bit about how you would use your model, how educators would use your model, like kind of on a practical daily basis.
Mm. So there's two parts. So the six-stage target model kind of fits into that proactive management. So it's something that we should be doing all the time, but it's also in the moment as well. It can be used as a dynamic tool. That before I go rushing in, I picking our battles, for instance. Is that something I need to pay attention to, or actually is me just telling that child off now, giving them attention that I'm actually reinforcing when I didn't mean to. Then the second is why this, why now, as I've already mentioned. Now, as you get to know, and it's so important, as you said, to get to know the children who we're working with, because if I'm thinking of those three questions, what's wrong for them, how are they feeling, and what might have happened in the past that could be presenting in the present. There was a really interesting study actually that was it was called the 2 minutes for 10 days study, and they went to a school and they asked all of these educators, name your most challenging student, and we all know. Every person who's listening, I guarantee they immediately that kid will
Something
pop into
comes
your
to
head.
mind.
Yeah, there's him. Oh. But they got them to name them, and then what they had to do for 5 days one week and then 5 days the next week, they had to actually spend at least 2 minutes a day just talking to that kid, not telling them what to do, not trying to teach them anything, just spending 2 minutes for 10 days, just having a conversation, getting to know them, trying to build some level of rapport and connection. And what was interesting, after that 10-day period, the behaviour of those particular children had significantly improved in those particular classes.
Wow.
And when those kids were asked, you seem to be getting on better in such and such's class, what's going on? Well, she seems to care. She actually cares about it. She's bothered. He actually listens. He's kind of cool. Okay. Because they were actually taking that time, that they were building trust. And I think one of the most important things when I'm looking at the preventative foundations is that the opposite to anxiety, the opposite to emotional dysregulation isn't calm, it's trust. If I'm with people I trust, in a place I trust, and I can trust myself, then there's nothing to feel anxious, agitated, or emotional about. So the more trust I've got, the better regulated I'm going to be as a result. The more in control I know I don't need to be as in control, because I know that there's people around me that will allow me to have that autonomy, power, and attention that I desperately am seeking and needing. And just taking that short amount of time to build trust and connection, well, it had a two-way process. One, it improved the behavior of the kids. But when the teachers at the end of those 10 days were asking, how do you feel towards those kids now? Those kids that used to find most challenging had become their favorite. Because suddenly they found out, well, the reason he sits there with his head on his desk and looks like he's sleeping isn't because he's being rude. I didn't realise that actually he has to help his two younger siblings get to school in the morning because both of his parents are disabled, and I never would have known that.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it changed the perspective of why some of the behaviour is occurring. Because I think it's so easy for us to get into that judgmental mentality, especially, and this is one of the key things I encourage everybody to kind of think about. Anytime you catch yourself making should or shouldn't statements, they should behave this way, they should respect me, they should tell the truth, they should listen, they should be doing that. Whenever you're saying should, that is based on your value structure, belief, and attitude, and I'm afraid that is not a universal law. And therefore, we need to investigate, well, why are they not, rather than they should, going, okay, well, they're not. So let me figure out what's the reason for that. And that could be something that's happening, nothing to do with the classroom. It could be that bottle of Coke has been well and truly shaken. You may have got, it might have blown the lid on top of you, but it got well and truly shaken by whatever's been going on over the weekend or in the morning, or with another kid that bullies them in the corridor before they come into the classroom and stuff like that. And it's so important to kind of recognize that.
Uh-huh. What you said about trust really resonates with me. That's one of the first things we have to develop with children, especially in a daycare setting. we're working with the youngest of children, sometimes starting at 12 months. They're still
Mm.
really infants, and we have to build up that trust. And that is one of the things we find challenging in the very beginning with children, is building that trust. And especially when they're, in the middle of separation anxiety, they've just separated from their parents for the first time. And that is one of the things that our educators face all the time as we get new children in. So can you give me some strategies or maybe some advice? What can we do to build trust in those early days? Especially when we're dealing with nonverbal children who are very young. We can't really we could talk to them, but it's not like a conversation where we'll
Yeah.
find out things about them. Tell me, maybe if you have some ideas on what we could do to help in that scenario.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, and the should and the should not and things like that, is going into the we start to set expectations of where we feel a child should and should not be in their development. And unfortunately, whether due to neurodiversity, whether down to trauma, circumstance, or also just kids being different, we might find that where we think where they are chronologically developed may not be the same as their emotional, cognitive development, communication development. So we sometimes need to go where they actually are rather than where we think they should be. So I think the instinct is, especially when they're kind of starting those early education environments, they should be able to do this and the other, or self-regulated. We might need to go, okay, well, what would a regressed attachment building activity be for maybe even a younger child? Now, so one of the things that when I was in the fostering world, we often had babies. And we sometimes, if we were encountering a baby that had unfortunately, for whatever reason, been removed from their parents due to trauma and neglect, abuse and stuff like that, we often had to regress our behavior as if they were a newborn again, and then build that trust up from there. Now, a lot of the models that I teach, I always say it's common sense approaches to parenting for a baby, but just applied to anybody. Okay. If a baby was crying, we wouldn't go in and go, right, stop that, or I'm taking the rattle off you. You just try desperately to figure out what might be causing the baby distress. You'd go through your usual tick criteria of, right, does it need feeding? Is it cold? Does it need burping? Does it this? Is that the other? Does it need changing? But if you couldn't figure it out, then you would just co-regulate with the baby. You would just go, listen to my heartbeat, listen to my breathing. I'm calm to let you know that you are safe. Because young children and babies don't have that same understanding of the world, therefore they're picking up cues on the adults around them. So if I've got an adult who's getting agitated, getting irritated, getting distressed, panicking because they can't get their child to calm, well, actually, my lack of calm is communicating to that child, you're not safe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like you've ever seen a dog owner who's walking down the street with their dog on the lead, and then they see another dog coming towards them, and this dog owner then pulls their dog really close in and close to them and kind of just almost gives a wide berth to the other dog. Well,
Mm-hmm.
actually, that dog owner is communicating to their dog, hey, we're in a really dangerous situation here. This is something we should be really cautious of. There's a threat. So
Right.
actually, that owner is communicating to the dog, you may need to attack here because we're unsafe. They're increasing the likelihood of those dogs fighting because of the
Right.
behavior of the owner, not because of the behavior of the dog.
Right.
And that's what caregivers need to kind of consider when it comes to building the trust with those young people. We're looking for high levels of oxytocin development. So oxytocin is that hormone that's released in connection. Why do I feel distressed? Because mum's not here. Yes, there's certain attachments, but I trust her. I don't trust you. So how are you going to build trust? Through consistency, through connection, through engagement, through you coming into my world rather than just expecting me to come into yours.
Right. Yeah.
So
And that's so true. It's something, like I said, that we face often, as new children come into the system all the time. It's an ongoing concern where we're constantly introducing new children into the daycare, children who've never been away from parents. And I love what you're saying about, going back a little bit, going to treating them like, a newborn in a way, in
yeah,
your
not
interactions
literally,
with
not
them.
going to,
Not literally,
if
but,
I'm working with
in
a
our
12-year-old,
interactions.
I don't pick them up and rock them, but they need me to be there in a similar way. So, yeah.
Yes.
But one thing
Yeah.
that educators and people in those kind of settings don't always think of, because we may take it as a minor, but let's say you've got a kid who's been with you for a little while and then you're introducing another child into that setting. Well, straight away, another child coming in, well, that's competition, as you said, for my connection, my attachment. Are you going to like them more than me? Those things are already coming out. So you'll sometimes get a regression in behavior from just the slightest bit of change or the slightest bit of transition, because that's something that they didn't control, and they don't know what that uncertainty is going to create anxiety. And when we get anxiety, we then regress back to old models of coping.
Right.
So that's something to bear in mind, that sometimes it feels like you're going 2 steps forwards and then 1 step back with some children. Well, that's pretty normal. Most smokers. There's a famous quote from Mark Twain, isn't there? Quitting smoking's easy. I've done it hundreds of times. Because most smokers will quit and then they'll go back to it at some point. Then they'll quit and then go back to it. Because when we're feeling lost and stressed, we go back to old pathways, old behaviours that used to make us feel better. Children are no different from adults.
Yeah. I think it's about setting expectations. Kind of that's what you're getting at, right? Know what the expectations are. Know that any kind of change, like introducing a new child into the classroom, might affect other children in the classroom. And that can help you in being that detective that is trying to figure out what's going on in your room and why children are behaving in certain ways. And how to assist them, basically. Sometimes I find that educators just want to stop the behavior. But really, what we're trying to do is build coping mechanisms, build new ways of interacting and dealing with the different situations. So it's all about educating at every level.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, you had mentioned earlier about your approach being person-centered. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean by person-centered, and how does that affect early childhood educators?
I've kind of adhered to it, or mentioned it slightly anyway. As I sort of said, the preventative level of the hierarchy is kind of looking on the environment itself. How do we lay the room out to promote kind of inclusivity and to promote engagement of play and things like that? When we're moving into the proactive management, we have to go to a child-centered point of view to some degree or another, because you take any two children, the way that two different children will play will be completely different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
The way two children, what triggers two children is going to be completely different. But what helps to regulate two different children is probably going to be different as well. The same as it is for adults. You could take a couple, for instance, and they have an argument. You'll see from the behaviour of how they both decide that they want to resolve the argument and to regulate, they will usually have completely different ways of doing it. So that's why one's going, I'm walking away because I just need to create some space to self-regulate. And the other's potentially following that person around going, we need to talk about this. And because of that, they're clashing. But if I'm coming in from an external going, they need to walk away and they just need a few minutes by themselves, but they need to kind of talk it through. And maybe I just need to be quiet and sit with them and stay with them while they're kind of then venting and talking it out. So with two adults, I tried two completely different strategies. So the same with two children. Now, as you
Right.
said, that's a challenge when you've got 8 kids to 1 and stuff like that, that then we've got to mix up. Now, a lot of the places I teach, we're talking more 30 to 1 as far as the school ratios are concerned,
Yeah.
and that whole different kettle of fish. But
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm meaning. It's just because it works for me doesn't mean it'll work for them.
Right.
It's going to be different needs. If we look at human beings are incredibly complex. This thing between our ears is the most complex thing in the known universe. Over 100 billion individual neurons, each of those individual neurons with 100 to 1,000 individual synapses. So we've got multiple trillions. So I say it's a bit like, so the weather is a complex system. Okay, in the fact that a butterfly can flap its wing over here and cause a tornado in Mexico, for instance. So I would consider myself, even though I've been studying the subject for 18, 19 years, I'm like a fairly mediocre weatherman. So I can kind of go, I roughly can know whether that child's going to be okay or not. I can look out the window and roughly know whether I could get away with shorts today, but I've often been caught in the rain. Sometimes it just goes wrong. And I think that's understanding the nature of human beings. We are simple in some ways and we follow a certain pattern, but they're also the devil's in the difference, the devil's in the detail. That suddenly is a case of, and every day will be different. It works with that kid today, and then tomorrow you find, oh, okay, that's not working anymore, or that anymore. And that's where it has to be. Just because you think it should stay the same, just because you think this should work, doesn't mean it will with that particular kid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what we're all pointing to here is just the mindset, right? What your mindset is going into how you interact with children, what you expect from them, how you interact with them. We can go so deep into this. I mean, not every early childhood educator is going to go get a psychology degree, but it's almost like we need to know those things because we impact children in such, profound way.
Mm.
But thank you so much for being here today. We could go on and keep talking about this topic. I know my educators specifically would love to hear more from you. So tell us, how could we learn more about what you have to offer? Where can we get your book? Things like that. Where can we find out more about you?
Yeah, fantastic. I have my own podcast as well. So obviously people are welcome to kind of listen in. It's called Able to Care. We do mix it up as far as, whether it be adult, child and stuff like that. But there's a lot of stuff around children. We tend to have one adult, one child and kind of fluctuate. So there's always some interesting topics and stuff that we talk about. My book, I'll hold up the cover.
Sure.
Trying to cover this in like a half hour in a half hour podcast is hard work to do. This has been my passion project. So it's called Targeting the Positive with Behaviours that Challenge, Empathic Strategies for Working with Children and Adults. It is available on Amazon.com.
Well, I'm glad we connected and thank you so much for being on the podcast today. And I wish you much success with what you have going on.
My pleasure. And thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello and welcome back. I'm so inspired by today's conversation with Andy Baker to talk about challenging behavior. And the very first thing that I understood from our conversation or that I learned was that language matters, obviously, and that we should maybe change the language to, instead of challenging behavior that challenges, because that's different for everyone, as he pointed out during the podcast. So I really liked that viewpoint, and that's definitely something I want to carry forward. Another takeaway was in regards to trust. And, I really believe that in order to encourage positive behavior with children, we need to develop a connection with them. And to develop that connection, we need to build trust. We need them to trust us. And so we need to invest our time and our efforts into building trust with children. And if that means having conversations with them, if they're a little bit older, or even just providing their basic needs, comforting them, nurturing them, those are all strategies that are going to help us to develop the trust so that we can help them to regulate when they do become dysregulated or when they are feeling anxious. And hopefully those instances will be less and less as we start to develop that trusting relationship and that connection with them. The final takeaway is really about mindset. It's about changing our belief system, our values, our judgments, our prejudgments about children. They're doing something to bother me, or they are acting out this way to push my buttons. Those kind of mindsets are very limiting and don't help the child. I feel like we need to approach children with a more open mindset of what can I do to help this child? And I really like the question, why now? Why are they doing this and why now? And really become detectives in figuring the answers out to those questions. Why are they doing this and why now? And really understanding children from their point of view. Those are my most important takeaways from today. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. And we're going to be doing many more episodes to help tackle this very difficult issue of managing children's behaviors in the classroom. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in to the ECE Classroom with SusieBeghin. For more information, you can visit our website at www.susiebeghin.com. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast so you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. Thanks for listening.